Hey again, night owls. If you're still here, congratulations. You've survived the dust, the gunpowder, and the bad coffee of the early frontier. Now let's drift into something even weirder: social life in the Wild West. Because believe it or not, people still had parties, weddings, and the occasional scandal, even when everyone smelled like horse and despair. Let's start in the saloon, because, well, where else would we? The saloon was basically the heartbeat of every town that had more than 6 people and a dream. It wasn't just a bar, it was a courtroom, a gossip center, a hotel, and sometimes a very bad church. If you needed to know who shot who married who, or who was pretending to be someone else, the bartender knew, and probably didn't care. Saloons were loud, sticky, and full of cigarette smoke, which was sort of like fog, but angrier. The floorboards creaked, the piano was always slightly out of tune, and there was usually some guy trying to sell a miracle tonic that could cure everything from baldness to bullet wounds. Spoiler, it cured neither. Whiskey was the main event, of course. But don't imagine fine bourbon in crystal glasses. We're talking about harsh, bootlegged stuff that could probably dissolve iron nails, and sometimes did. If you didn't go blind, it was considered a good batch. Now, the ladies, or as newspapers politely called them, entertainers. Many of them were just trying to survive. And the West wasn't exactly full of job openings for women other than laundress or please serve drinks while dodging bullets. But these women ran the show. They could charm, negotiate, and occasionally outshoot the men. Some even ran entire saloons or boarding houses on their own. It wasn't glamorous, but it was power, in corset form. And let's not forget the gamblers. These guys were the unofficial philosophers of the West. They lived by one rule: luck is better than law. They floated from town to town wearing dusty suits and suspicious smiles. Cards, dice, horses, if it could move, they bet on it. And when they weren't winning, they were cheating, which led to duels, which led to funerals, which led to more whiskey. It was a full ecosystem. Then there were the outlaws, the celebrities of the West. People loved to read about them, even as they robbed trains and burned down post offices. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy. Half of them were just local criminals with good PR. But newspapers turned them into legends, because nothing sold papers like a bad guy with great hair. And the sheriffs? They were fine. Mostly tired, mostly outnumbered. Their job was less about enforcing the law and more about making sure nobody exploded the saloon again before Friday. Half the time, they ended up drinking with the same men they arrested the night before. Justice was flexible out there. Even weddings were strange. Picture a dusty chapel, a preacher who arrived late, and a bride whose bouquet was mostly tumbleweed. Sometimes the groom didn't show up. Sometimes he was already wanted in 3 territories. But life went on, because it had to. That's the quiet truth about the frontier. People were lonely, but they still tried to find some rhythm in the chaos. There was also music, sort of. Pianos missing half their keys, fiddles tuned to something resembling pain, and the occasional harmonica solo that could make a coyote cry. Yet somehow, under those oil lamps, it must have felt like magic. The sound of laughter, off-key singing, clinking glasses, a fragile kind of normal. A reminder that even in a world of dust and danger, people still wanted joy, or at least something that felt like it. Let's float a little further down the trail, to the quieter side of Western life. The mornings after the parties, the dusty sunrise spilling across the main street, a hungover cowboy sweeping the porch, a dog barking at nothing. The kind of peace that only exists between two disasters. You can almost hear the faint whistle of the windmill, the soft creak of the saloon sign. Everything still smells like whiskey, dust, and maybe regret. But it's calm. And out here, that's good enough. Because despite the chaos, the Wild West wasn't just gunfights and gold rushes. It was people trying, failing, and trying again. Just humans in bad boots under an endless sky. So next time someone romanticizes the Wild West, just remember, it wasn't glamorous, it was gritty, exhausting, and weirdly human. And maybe that's why it still fascinates us, because deep down, we all kinda love a mess. If you're still awake or pretending to be, thanks for drifting through another dusty corner of history with me. Next time, we'll wander into something equally strange, maybe royal scandals or ancient disasters, something perfectly boring to fall asleep to. And hey, if your eyelids are somehow still open, you might as well subscribe so you'll find your way back when the next sleepy story rides into town. Good night, traveler.
Hey there again. Still awake? If you've somehow made it this far through the sandstorm of whiskey, dust, and poor decisions, congratulations! You've officially survived longer than most people did in the real Wild West. Let's ease into the last stretch of our little historical nap, the end of the frontier. Because yes, even the Wild West had to grow up eventually, or at least pretend to. It didn't happen with a bang. No epic final gunfight, no cowboy riding into the sunset with dramatic music. It just faded, like the glow of a lantern running out of oil. By the late 1800s, the railroad had done what every outlaw feared. It made things efficient. Trains rolled in with order, bureaucracy, and tickets. Three things that instantly killed cowboy culture. You could no longer rob a stagecoach when the gold was being shipped on steel rails, guarded by men with federal paychecks. The world got smaller, and the wilderness got fenced off. Freedom became inconvenient. And then came telegraphs, phones, newspapers, and the one thing every cowboy hated most, rules. The West started to look less like a dream and more like a country trying to act civilized. Suddenly there were property taxes, town meetings, dress codes. People complained about noise ordinances in towns that were literally built on gunfire. The old gunslingers aged out. Some became lawmen, others became drifters, and a few, the lucky ones, got themselves written into the growing mythology of America. Because as soon as the West started dying, people began romanticizing it. It's a strange habit humans have. We mourn chaos by turning it into art. Buffalo Bill, for instance, figured this out before anyone else. He took the Wild West, polished it a little, and put it on tour. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show became a traveling circus of nostalgia, complete with cowboys, native warriors, and dramatic reenactments of things that never actually happened. People loved it. Finally, you could buy tickets to the myth, and it came with popcorn. But out there in the real dust, life was quieter. The towns emptied, the mines closed, the cattle drives slowed down, and one by one, the saloons shuttered their doors, the piano stopped, the cards stopped, the endless noise faded into memory. It wasn't all bad, though. The land healed. The people built rail stations, schools, and hospitals, things you can't exactly fit between bar fights. Families replaced gunmen, trains replaced horses, and progress, in its boring, bureaucratic way, finally won. Still, there's something haunting about it all. The silence that came after the chaos. A land that once echoed with hoofs and gunshots, now whispering with wind through empty windows. Even today, if you visit an old ghost town like Bodie in California or Deadwood before the casinos, you can feel it. That faint vibration of lives once lived too loudly. There's a kind of peace in that silence, like the land itself exhaled. Finally, no one was shooting at anyone, and no one was selling miracle tonics out of wagons. Just dust, sunlight, and the slow reclamation of the earth. And maybe that's the real ending. Not the gunfights or the gold rushes, but the quiet that followed. The West didn't die because it was defeated. It died because it was done. It had played its part, written its legends, and left behind just enough stories for people like us to stay up too late talking about it. So as we drift out of the saddle one last time, picture it. The endless prairie, fading orange sky, the soft creak of a windmill turning somewhere far away. No noise, no glory, just time, doing what it always does, moving on. And with that, we'll let the dust settle. Thanks for wandering through this sleepy, slow-motion history with me. I hope it made you a little bit sleepy, or at least slower in the best way. If you're still awake and somehow want more of this soft historical nonsense, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. That way, when the next sleepy story drifts in, maybe about forgotten kings or cursed empires, you'll be here, blanket ready, eyes half closed, letting history do what it does best, gently bore you to sleep. Good night, traveler, and may your dreams be quieter than a cowboy town at dawn.
Hey there, traveler. You're still here, which probably means either you really love history or you're just too cozy to move. Either way, that's fine. Let's keep floating a little further, past the railroads, past the last gunfight, into the quiet years, when the Wild West wasn't wild anymore, just tired. You see, even after the world moved on, some people didn't. They stayed. Because home, no matter how dusty or broken, was still home. Let's start with the ghost towns. Places that were once booming, filled with shouting miners, clinking bottles, and the faint sound of someone losing their paycheck in a card game. Then, one day, the gold ran out, and like magic, the people vanished. Houses stood half-finished, beds still made, plates still on tables. It was as if the whole town took a lunch break and just never came back. Wind replaced conversation, tumbleweeds replaced children, and every creaking shutter became part of a ghostly choir. You can still visit some of those towns, places like Bodie, Calico, and Danik. They're frozen in time, like an old photograph someone forgot to put away. Boots still hang on pegs. A piano sits in the saloon, its keys yellowed and cracked. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the old laughter echoing through the dust. Almost. Then there were the ranchers who refused to leave. The railroads cut through their land. The cities grew up around them, and still they stayed. Because moving east meant admitting defeat, and the West never did that well. These people became living relics, caught between centuries, still waking up before dawn, still riding out to check fences that no one cared about anymore. It was less a life, more a stubborn memory that refused to fade. And then there were the storytellers, old cowhands and drifters who hung around saloons telling younger men about the good old days, usually while conveniently forgetting how bad those days actually were. They'd talk about gunfights, horses, gold, and glory, leaving out the toothaches, hunger, and occasional dysentery. Nostalgia's funny that way. It polishes pain into legend. One of my favorite things about these people is how they never saw themselves as history. They were just living, fixing roofs, mending boots, arguing about cattle prices. Meanwhile, somewhere out east, writers and painters were turning them into myth. By the time dime novels became popular, half of what people believed about the West was fiction. But that was fine. The truth was dusty and complicated, and the myth sold better. There's a strange comfort in that, though. The idea that the past can become softer with time, that gunfights can turn into bedtime stories, and loneliness can turn into poetry. It's like the West knew that to survive in memory, it had to become beautiful, even if it never really was. Let's drift for a second. Imagine the setting sun over a ghost town. The light catches on broken windows, and the air hums with that heavy silence that only old places have. There's a single horse grazing in the distance, the faint smell of sagebrush, and somewhere, deep in the cracks of an old saloon floor, a coin still glints under the dust, the last trace of someone's forgotten luck. That's the real West. Not the gunfights, not the gold, but the stillness that followed, the echo of human effort fading into nature's patience. Even the animals moved on. The great buffalo herds, the wild mustangs, the prairie wolves, all pushed aside by fences and trains. But a few stayed, adapting to the new world quietly. A hawk circling an abandoned barn, a coyote trotting through a town square that hasn't seen a person in decades. Life always finds a way to hang around, even after the story's over. And so, the last cowboys rode their final trails. Some ended up working in rodeos, turning their past into performance. Others just faded into the background. Old men in wide hats, sitting outside general stores, watching the future roll by in Model T Fords. They probably didn't like the noise. By the time the 1920s arrived, the West wasn't wild anymore. It was nostalgic. And nostalgia, as we know, is the slowest kind of death. Not a quick end, just a gentle dissolving into memory. But in that fading, something beautiful happened. The world learned how to remember. The stories, the myths, the quiet sadness, they became part of something bigger. A shared dream about freedom, danger, and dusty sunsets. Something you could revisit whenever real life felt too normal. So maybe the Wild West never really died. It just went to sleep. Somewhere between myth and memory. Somewhere between the sound of a crackling campfire and the whisper of wind through sagebrush. And that's probably where it still is. Waiting. Calm, quiet, timeless. For someone to tell the story again. Someone like, well, you and me.
Hey again, traveler. If you're still awake, impressive. If you're half asleep, even better. Because this next part is softer, slower, and maybe a little sad. We've talked about gunslingers, gold, and whiskey, but what about the people who kept everything else from falling apart? Yeah, the women of the Wild West. Now, Hollywood loves to pretend the West was a man's world. Cowboys, sheriffs, outlaws, all fighting over dusty pride and poorly cooked beans. But in reality, the West only worked because women made it livable. They were the quiet backbone holding up the chaos, cooking, cleaning, teaching, healing, surviving, and doing it all while wearing dresses in 110-degree heat. Honestly, they deserved more medals than the lawmen ever got. Let's start with the frontier wives, the ones who followed their husbands into the unknown. Imagine this. You pack everything you own into a rattling wagon, head west into nothingness, and when you finally stop, your husband says, "Well, honey, this seems like a nice patch of dirt." And then that's your new home. No neighbors, no store, just wind, loneliness, and the faint sound of coyotes singing about your bad decisions. Days were long, water was scarce, and childbirth, well, that was Russian roulette with the prayer. Doctors were rare, midwives rarer, and comfort wasn't really a word that existed. Yet somehow, these women kept entire families alive in conditions most of us wouldn't survive 5 minutes in. They weren't just homemakers, they were warriors with aprons. Then there were the teachers, the school marms, as old books like to call them. Usually young, unmarried women who rode miles through dust and storms just to teach a handful of kids in one-room schoolhouses. Their classrooms had more spiders than books, and their students often came armed with slingshots and bad attitudes. But those women taught the next generation how to read, write, and dream beyond the horizon. They brought civilization to places where civilization had clearly decided to skip. And we can't forget the saloon girls. Often painted as flirtatious dancers in movies, in truth, they were survivors. Many were widows, orphans, or women running from something worse back east. The saloon was dangerous, yes, but it was also one of the few places a woman could earn her own money. Between pouring whiskey and dodging wandering hands, they built small empires of resilience. They were smart, tough, and sharper than any cowboy thought. They saw everything, and most of them outlived the men who underestimated them. Then there were the ranch women, the ones who could ride, rope, and shoot as well as any man, sometimes better. While their husbands were off trying to tame something or prove something, they ran the land, fed the animals, fixed the fences, raised the kids, and probably saved the farm half a dozen times without ever being thanked for it. They weren't looking for glory. They were looking for rain, food, and maybe 5 minutes of silence. And then the women who history tried to erase completely, indigenous women. They were the first to live on that land long before it was called the West. They saw the newcomers arrive, watched their world change forever, and somehow carried their cultures through unimaginable loss. They taught survival, traded skills, and often helped settlers who didn't even bother to remember their names. They were the true keepers of the land, quiet, patient, and endlessly strong. But even among the settlers, there were rebels, women who didn't follow the rules at all, like Calamity Jane, who dressed like a man, rode with soldiers, drank with outlaws, and probably could outswear a sailor. Or Annie Oakley, who became a living legend with the rifle, hitting targets that most men missed, all while maintaining perfect posture and a sharp weight. They were the cracks in the wall of expectation, proof that the frontier didn't belong to one kind of person. And then there were the quiet ones, the nameless wives and mothers buried under wooden crosses with no carvings. Their stories didn't make newspapers or ballads, but their endurance shaped everything. Every homestead, every dusty town, every meal cooked over a weak fire. It was all held together by hands that history forgot to thank. That's the real story of the West. Not the noise, but the endurance. Sometimes I think about what those nights must have felt like. A woman sitting by the fire, sewing under dim lantern light, listening to the wind scrape against the cabin walls. Her husband may be gone for days, her kids asleep, and that endless silence stretching out forever. No sound but the crackle of fire and her own thoughts. That kind of solitude can break a person or make them stronger than steel. Most of them, they chose the latter. And you know what's wild? Most of those women never called themselves heroes. They didn't write books or demand recognition. They just did what needed to be done because someone had to do it. They carried the West on their backs quietly, one sunrise at a time. So when we talk about the Wild West, maybe we should whisper a little thank you to them. The teachers, the wives, the mothers, the saloon girls, the ranchers, and the dreamers. They didn't fire the guns or steal the gold, but they're the reason anyone survived long enough to tell the stories. So let's end this part where all things end in the West, under a wide, endless sky. A woman sitting on her porch watching the sun dip behind the hills. Her hands calloused, her heart tired, but her spirit still unbroken. Because even when the world forgot her, the land remembered. And that's the quiet truth of the forgotten women of the frontier. They didn't need legends, they became them, one weary breath at a time. If you're still here, still drifting somewhere between sleep and history, hit subscribe before you nod off. That way, when we return for the next slow chapter, maybe the haunted railroads or the last buffalo hunters, you'll already have your spot by the campfire. Good night, traveler. Sleep well. And remember, sometimes the strongest people in history are the ones who never asked to be remembered.
Hey there, still awake? If you are, that's impressive. If you're not, well, that's kind of the point, isn't it? Because tonight, we're gliding into one of the saddest, quietest chapters of the Wild West, the slow disappearance of everything wild. The buffalo, the wolves, the open plains, all the things that once defined the frontier, fading away, one rifle shot and one railroad track at a time. Let's start with the buffalo, or bison if you want to be technically correct and slightly annoying at parties. Once upon a time, there were millions of them, herds so big they looked like moving shadows across the prairie. The ground literally shook when they ran. To the Plains tribes, they were sacred. Food, clothing, tools, everything. The buffalo wasn't just an animal, it was life itself. And then, of course, the settlers arrived, with rifles, railroads, and a habit of turning everything into profit. They didn't just hunt buffalo, they annihilated them. By the 1870s, hunting buffalo became a kind of sport for men with too much free time and not enough empathy. Trains would slow down so passengers could lean out the windows and shoot at herds for fun, because apparently the boredom of train travel required mass extinction. The U.S. Army encouraged it too. Killing buffalo meant starving indigenous tribes, forcing them onto reservations by destroying their food source. It was strategy disguised as progress. And it worked. In less than a decade, the great herds were gone. From tens of millions to a few hundred survivors. Just bones and silence on the plains. Buffalo hides were shipped east by the trainload, their skulls piled up like mountains, literal mountains, bleached white under the sun. And somewhere between the last shot and the first photograph, the Wild West lost its heartbeat. Because without the buffalo, the land itself changed. The grass grew strange, the wind sounded lonelier, and the people, both native and settler, realized too late what they destroyed. But the buffalo weren't the only ones disappearing. The wolves went next. The settlers hated them, blamed them for every missing calf and bad dream. So they poisoned them, trapped them, hunted them for bounties. It became another kind of sport, a grim, quiet war against nature. And the wolves, who once sang to the moon in every valley, fell silent. Even the wild horses,
Descendants of Spanish breeds began to vanish, driven off the plains to make room for cattle and fences. The prairie dogs were poisoned, the eagles shot for trophies. It was like the West was being scrubbed clean, not out of cruelty, but out of a strange obsession with control. Humans just couldn't stand the idea of something untamed. And then there were the hunters themselves, the last buffalo men, people like Buffalo Bill Cody, who built his fame on killing over 4,000 buffalo to feed railroad workers. He later turned into a showman, recreating the old days on stage as if he didn't help end them in the first place. There's a strange irony in that, turning extinction into entertainment. But that's how myths work. We destroy, and then we romanticize what we've destroyed. By the 1880s, the plains were quiet. The great herds gone, the predators gone, the horizon empty. Ranchers replaced hunters. The wilderness turned into property lines and grazing permits. And the people who once lived alongside nature, both native and settler, now lived above it, as if they were the masters of a kingdom that no longer needed them. Yet, something strange happened after that. Regret. A few people began to realize what had been lost. Conservation started as a whisper, a handful of men and women trying to protect what little was left. By the early 1900s, the government declared it illegal to hunt buffalo. Preserves were created, small herds were protected, and from those survivors, maybe 500 animals, all the buffalo alive today are descended. Nature, once again, proving it can heal if you give it time. But the silence never left. Even now, if you stand on the plains at dusk, you can feel it. That lingering absence, the ghosts of the herds, the faint echo of hooves that once shook the earth. It's not spooky, just lonely, like a song that ended mid-note and never got finished. The frontier wasn't just a story about human survival. It was also about everything that didn't survive because of us. And in a strange, sleepy way, that's the real ending of the Wild West. Not the last gunfight, but the last buffalo. When the land stopped moving and the people realized they'd been chasing a dream that only existed as long as the wilderness did. So, the next time someone says they wish they could have lived in the Wild West, just smile and say, you wouldn't survive a day. Not because of the gunfights, but because the land itself would break your heart. And maybe that's why we still talk about it. The West was never really about freedom or glory. It was about loss. A slow, beautiful, dusty kind of loss. The kind that settles in your bones and stays there. So as you drift off tonight, picture that endless horizon, the last buffalo fading into the orange light, the wind brushing over tall grass, the world quieter than it's ever been. And somewhere out there, maybe, a single hoof print still holding the memory of what was once alive. If your eyes are heavy and your mind's wandering across those empty plains, go ahead and subscribe before you fall asleep. There are more forgotten corners of history waiting for you. More ghosts, more dust, more quiet stories that deserve to be whispered before the lights go out. Good night, traveler, and may your dreams wander somewhere between the past and the prairie sky.
The story doesn't end when the guns fall silent. It doesn't end when the buffalo vanish or when the railroads stretch across the plains. No, the Wild West ends in a whisper, in the towns that stayed long after everyone else left. Ghost towns. That's what they call them now. But once they were alive, buzzing with the sound of pickaxes, piano music, and half-drunken laughter spilling out of saloon doors. Gold, silver, hope, all glowing like lanterns in the night. Then one morning, the mines ran dry. The dreams did too. And one by one, people packed up their lives, their stories, their failures, and left. They left behind buildings, wagons, boots, love letters, everything. And the wind took the rest. Now, what's left are bones of wood and rust, creaking signs, windows with no glass, a single door swinging in the wind like a metronome counting the years. If you listen close, you can almost hear the echoes. Footsteps on wooden floors, laughter that stopped mid-sentence, the kind of silence that remembers sound. But not everyone left. Some people stayed. They couldn't let go, or maybe the land wouldn't let go of them. There's always one man in every ghost town who refuses to die with it. A prospector who swears there's still gold under the hills. A widow who still sets 2 plates at dinner. A storekeeper who opens every morning even though no one comes. The newspapers used to call them the last souls of the West. People who lived among dust and memory. They'd write letters to relatives who'd long since replying. Some didn't even notice the years passing. Their town became their world, and the world forgot them back. Take Bodie, California. Once one of the richest mining towns in America, 10,000 people, 60 saloons, and more gunfights than church bells. By 1900, it was almost empty. By 1940, the last residents were ghosts themselves. Today, it's preserved exactly as it was left. Plates still on the tables, curtains still in the windows, as if everyone just stepped out for air and never came back. A whole town frozen mid-breath. Then there's Rhyolite, Nevada. Born in a gold rush, dead within a decade. At its peak, it had electric lights, running water, and even an opera house. By 1920, it was nothing but dust and broken bottles. The desert moved in, slowly swallowing everything, one sand dune at a time. And Tombstone, Arizona. Tombstone tried to outlive the others. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral put it on the map forever. But even legends can't pay the bills. When the mines flooded, people left, and the town became a museum to its own myth. The only thing that truly survived was the story. If you've ever walked through one of those ghost towns at sunset, you know the feeling. The way the air goes still, the sound of your footsteps echoing through streets that used to belong to someone else. You can almost see shadows moving, not ghosts really, just memories replaying themselves. A card game that never ended. A piano that still hums under the dust. A lantern light that refuses to go out. And yet, there's something peaceful about it. Because in those empty places, time finally gave up chasing itself. The West stopped being about survival or conquest. It became a kind of silence. Not death, but rest. Like the land exhaled and decided it had done enough. The people who stayed behind, the ones who refused to leave, became part of that silence. Their stories faded into the wind, into the cracking paint and the tumbleweeds rolling past. No one remembers their names, but if you close your eyes and listen, you might still hear them whisper, "Don't forget us!" And maybe that's why we tell these stories. To keep them company. To remind the world that once, out here, dreams burned bright, even if they didn't last. So as you drift off tonight, imagine walking down that empty main street. The stars above brighter than any lamp, your footsteps soft on the old wooden boards, and every door you pass, every window you glance through, filled not with ghosts, but with memory. The West, asleep, finally at peace. Before your eyes close, make sure to subscribe, partner. There are still a few more trails to ride, a few more forgotten corners of history to whisper through. Because in this channel, no story really dies. It just fades gently, like the echo of a train long gone over the horizon. Good night, traveler. Rest easy under the endless western sky. Moon.
By the late 1800s, the Wild West was already not so wild. But the cowboy, that scruffy, half-mythical figure, refused to vanish quietly. He lingered like smoke from a dying campfire. And America, sentimental as always, couldn't let go of him either. The cowboy was supposed to be free, a man alone under the sky, no rules but his own, living on black coffee and bad decisions. But by the time the 20th century started creeping in, that dream had turned into something else, a memory people were already nostalgic for. Real cowboys, the ones who actually worked cattle, weren't movie heroes. They were tired men with sunburned faces, sore backs, and too many stories about dust storms and horses that hated them. Most were poor. Most didn't own the land they rode on, and many were black, Mexican, or native, the kind of people Hollywood would later forget to include in the myth. Still, there was something beautiful about their simplicity. The long, slow rhythm of a cattle drive, the quiet moments around the fire, boots off, stars endless above. They lived in a world that moved at the pace of hooves, steady, stubborn, and utterly unaware of what was coming next. Then came barbed wire. It sounds harmless, doesn't it? Just a twisted strand of metal. But it killed the open range faster than any outlaw ever could. Fences went up, cattle routes were blocked, and the great wide spaces shrank into property lines. Cowboys started working for ranches instead of roaming free. No more drifting, no more endless horizon, just another job. Clock in, clock out, mend fences, feed cattle. The frontier was closing, and with it went the illusion of freedom. And yet, people couldn't stop romanticizing it. Eastern riders, who'd probably faint if a horse sneezed near them, started writing cowboy stories. Then came dime novels, stage shows, and the circus-like glory of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. He turned history into performance, reenacting gunfights, stampedes, and Indian battles for polite audiences in New York and London. It was America's first big rebranding. The messy, violent West was repackaged into something entertaining, something nostalgic before it was even gone. You can almost picture it. Buffalo Bill, silver mustache glinting under the lights, waving his hat to cheering crowds. A cast of real cowboys, real Native Americans, real soldiers, all playing themselves, pretending to be the people they already were. The line between truth and myth blurred forever. And that's when the cowboy stopped being a person and became a story. By the early 1900s, movies picked up the torch. Silent westerns, black and white duels, heroes with clean shirts and moral clarity that never existed in real life. The cowboy became the symbol of rugged individualism, that stubborn belief that one man and one horse could tame anything. It was comforting, simple, and false, but people loved it. Meanwhile, the real cowboys were still out there, not in saloons, not at high noon shootouts, but working quietly on ranches, waking before dawn, feeding the herd, living and dying without fanfare. Their world kept shrinking, but they didn't complain. They were used to disappearing things. Some historians like to say the frontier ended in 1890. The U.S. Census declared there was no longer an unbroken line of unsettled land. The map was full. But frontiers don't end with a date. They fade like campfire smoke, like memory, The last cowboys didn't notice it was over until the silence became permanent. There's an old photo from 1905, a group of cattlemen sitting on a fence near Abilene, Texas. They're not smiling, just staring at the camera, sunburned and dusty, with that look people get when they realize the world is moving on without them. Behind them, you can see telegraph poles stretching across the prairie. Progress, they called it, the death of distance. And in a way, that's what the cowboy represented all along. Distance. The gap between man and machine, between old and new, between what was wild and what became controlled. So when we talk about the last cowboys, we're not really talking about the end of ranching or riding horses. We're talking about the end of freedom as fantasy. The idea that you could live entirely on your own terms, out where no one could tell you what to do. Because sooner or later, the fences always go up. Still, the dream remains. Every few decades, someone tries to revive it. In movies, songs, or just in spirit. There's always a cowboy somewhere, in some form. A reminder of that brief, impossible moment when life was raw, open, and endlessly wide. And maybe that's why people can't stop sleeping to stories like this. Because the cowboy isn't just a man. He's the sound of wind through grass, the crunch of boots on dry earth, the long shadow of a setting sun that doesn't hurry to fade. So tonight, if you're still awake, picture it. An old cowboy sitting by a dying fire, his hat pulled low, the stars above too many to count. He's not young anymore. He's not chasing anything now, just sitting quietly, the world gone soft around him. He hums a tune you don't recognize, something half remembered. Then he leans back, tips his hat, and smiles. Guess that's enough riding for one life, he says softly, and the fire crackles one last time. The sky turns pale, morning comes, the frontier breathes out, and the story, our story, finally rests. Soft guitar strum fades in, warm amber light. And as the screen fades to gold, a quiet message appears. Subscribe for more sleepy history. Because out here, the stories never really end. They just ride off into the horizon. Good night, partner.
When the dust finally settled, the Wild West didn't end with a bang. It ended with a sigh. The guns rusted first, then the wagons, then the dreams. And all that was left was wind, soft, endless, indifferent. People like to think history stops when the excitement does. That once the railroads came, the telegraphs hummed, and the maps were filled in, everything simply paused. But the truth is quieter. The West didn't vanish. It just changed its voice. The buffalo disappeared. The native nations were broken apart, forced onto lands that didn't know their footsteps. And the great open silence of the plains, the silence that had held stories, spirits, and songs for thousands of years, became something lonelier. Not wild anymore, just empty. The pioneers who'd once called themselves brave started aging. They built towns with paved streets, schools, telephones, even electricity. Progress arrived like a polite stranger knocking on the door, unstoppable, inevitable. And the West, that land of endless risk and beauty, slowly turned into something familiar. If you could stand there today, on the same ground where wagons once creaked under the sun, you'd see highways instead, gas stations, billboards, a cowboy hat in a souvenir shop with a Made in China tag. History neatly packaged for tourists who don't stay long enough to hear the wind talk. But the land remembers. It always does. Underneath the asphalt and neon lights, the old bones of the frontier are still there. Ghost towns crumbling quietly into the sand, fences rusting, barns collapsing, desert flowers blooming through cracks. Time working in slow motion, erasing and preserving all at once. And maybe that's what makes the Wild West so haunting. It's not just that it's gone, it's that it refuses to be forgotten. People keep trying to rebuild it in stories, in movies, in songs with lazy guitars and wide-open skies. They turned it into a dream where men were simple and women wore long skirts that never got dusty, where good guys wore white hats, bad guys wore black, and the truth didn't matter much at all. But the real West was messy, beautiful, cruel, full of people who weren't legends, just humans doing their best in a world that didn't care about their dreams. And that's what makes it worth remembering. Because in that endless space between what we imagine and what really happened, something very human lingers, that stubborn hope that maybe out there we could start over. Even now, in the 21st century, people still drive out to those places, the old mining towns, the abandoned tracks, the dry plains where nothing grows. They park their cars, step into the stillness, and say things like, "Feels like the Old West, doesn't it?" But what they're really saying is, "I miss something I never had." That's the power of the frontier dream. It's not about survival anymore. It's about longing. The same kind of quiet, restless longing that keeps you awake at night or helps you fall asleep to stories like this. Because every time we tell these tales, we're not just remembering history, we're comforting it, tucking it in, making sure it still breathes a little. The cowboy, the outlaw, the pioneer, they're all just ghosts now, but they're polite ones. They don't haunt, they hum softly. Their voices carried by the desert wind, still murmuring the same thing. Keep riding, keep remembering. And so we do. Through stories, through songs, through quiet nights where the world feels older than it should, through the kind of sleepy retellings that smooth out the rough edges and turn hardship into something almost poetic. Because the Wild West was never just a place, it was an idea, a feeling, that faint shimmer at the edge of what's known, where the sky gets big and time slows down just enough for you to breathe. So tonight, as you let your eyes grow heavy, think of that. Think of the last campfire dying out somewhere in the desert, the faint hiss of wind through dry grass, the stars watching from above, patient as always. The story's over now. The horses are gone, the ghosts have gone quiet, and the West, that wild, restless dream, finally gets to rest too. And soft piano fades in, long, slow notes drifting like wind. If you've made it this far, you've crossed the whole frontier with me. Thank you for wandering through the dust. If your eyes are still open, go ahead and subscribe before you drift off. There's always another story waiting, another quiet corner of history that still remembers how to whisper. Sleep well, traveler. The West is quiet now. The fire's out. But the sky is still wide open.